Family isn't always blood. It's the people in your life who want you in theirs, the ones who accept you for who you are. My grandmother's words echoed in my mind as I stood on our circular driveway, a single suitcase at my feet, watching my father's Mercedes disappear down the tree-lined drive of Oakwood Estate. He hadn't even looked back. 18 years as their daughter, and they had discarded me with the same casual indifference they might show a houseplant that had outgrown its usefulness. What they couldn't possibly know was that in just 4 months, I would be standing in that same spot, keys in hand, as the legal owner of the historic estate they had inhabited for the past decade but never truly appreciated. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had begun like any other in the Mitchell household. My mother Kate's perfectly modulated voice discussing charity gala preparations on the phone while arranging fresh peonies in the entryway. My father Robert sequestered in his study reviewing property development plans. And my brother Ethan's occasional laughter drifting down from his room as he packed for his return to New York after a brief weekend visit. I'd been in the estate's East Wing conservatory, preparing my portfolio for the Rhode Island School of Design application, a decision I'd been putting off discussing with my parents. Oakwood Estate wasn't just a house. It was a historical landmark, a magnificent Queen Anne Victorian with wraparound porches, turrets, and stained glass that had somehow survived the decades while similar properties fell to developers' wrecking. Balls. My grandmother Maggie had lived here until her passing 2 years ago, and though my parents now occupied the space, it had always felt more like her home than theirs. Every creaking floorboard and leaded glass window told stories that my parents, with their preference for sleek minimalism and new construction, seemed determined to ignore. Emma, my mother appeared in the conservatory doorway, her camel cashmere, sweater and pearls at odds with the wild English garden visible through the windows. Your father wants to speak with you in his study, now. The tone told me everything I needed to know. Catherine Mitchell never used that particular clipped cadence unless something had displeased her immensely. I carefully closed my portfolio, tucking away the photographs I'd been curating, architectural studies of Oakwood's forgotten spaces, portraits of local craftspeople restoring similar historic properties, detail shots of century-old woodwork and fixtures that developers routinely discarded. My father's study was the only room in Oakwood that my parents had completely renovated to their taste. Walnut paneling replaced with stark white walls, vintage parquet covered by gray wall-to-wall carpeting, and my grandmother's antique desk, swapped for a glass and chrome monstrosity that looked like it belonged in a corporate headquarters rather than a Victorian masterpiece. "Close the door," he said without looking up from his computer screen, the glow illuminating the premature lines on his face, evidence of years spent scanning spreadsheets for profit opportunities in historic neighborhoods. Robert Mitchell had built his reputation by purchasing charming old buildings, gutting them, and transforming them into luxury condominiums that sold to wealthy urbanites seeking character without inconvenience. I sat in the steel-framed visitor's chair, resisting the urge to fidget as I'd done since childhood. At 18, I still felt like a 12-year-old in his presence, my opinions dismissible, my passions irrelevant. "Would you care to explain this?" He swiveled his monitor toward me, displaying the confirmation email for my RISD application fee payment. "I check the credit card statements, Emma. Always." "I was going to tell you," I began, hating how small my voice sounded. After I finished the portfolio. "We've discussed this," he interrupted, his voice carrying the weary disappointment I'd grown accustomed to over the years. "Multiple times. The plan has always been for you to attend Wharton for business, then join Mitchell Development." "We agreed." "You agreed," I corrected, surprising myself with the interruption. "I never wanted to go into real estate development, Dad. I've been telling you that for years. I want to study photography with a focus on architectural preservation. RISD has the exact program. Photography. He pronounced the word as though it were a communicable disease. A hobby, Emma, not a career. Certainly not worth $58,000 in annual tuition. Your brother understood his responsibilities to this family. By your age, Ethan had already completed 2 summer internships at Goldman and secured early admission to Wharton. I'm not Ethan, I said quietly. My father leaned back, studying me as he might evaluate a property with questionable investment potential. No, you're not. That much is clear. He pushed a folder across the desk. Your brother is on track to make junior partner. By 30, he owns his condo outright. He has a 5-year plan and a retirement portfolio. What do you have? A collection of photographs of doorknobs and window frames. The dismissal stung, though it shouldn't have after years of similar comments. My careful documentation of Oakwood's architectural details wasn't just about aesthetics. It was about history, craftsmanship, the stories embedded in physical spaces. But my father saw buildings only as assets to be leveraged, not as cultural artifacts worth preserving. My portfolio is about more than doorknobs, I said, opening the folder to find printouts of Wharton's application materials. It's about preserving what matters instead of tearing it down for profit, like what you want to do to grandmother's carriage house. His expression hardened. The carriage house conversion is happening, Emma. The plans are finalized, permits secured. That charming outbuilding, as you call it, will be demolished next month to make way for 3 luxury guest cottages that will significantly increase Oakwood's market value when we eventually sell. Grandmother would have hated that, I said, before I could stop myself. Your grandmother is no longer with us, my mother interjected from the doorway, having entered silently during our exchange. Her voice carried the practiced smoothness she used at charity functions when redirecting uncomfortable conversations. And while we respected Maggie's sentimental attachments to this property, we have to make practical decisions. Practical? Decisions like destroying a perfectly preserved 1890s carriage house with original slate roofing and hand-carved doors. The words tumbled out before I could censor them. There are preservation grants available. I've researched... Enough. My father closed the Wharton folder with finality. This isn't a negotiation, Emma. Your mother and I have indulged your photography phase long enough. It's time to grow up. Wharton's late application deadline is next week. You'll complete it tomorrow. I took a steadying breath, feeling something shift inside me, a quiet certainty replacing the familiar hesitation. No. The syllable hung in the air between us, simple but irrevocable. Excuse me? My mother's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose toward her immaculate hairline. I said no, I repeated, my voice steadier. I'm applying to Rhode. I've already paid the fee, submitted my transcripts, and I'm finishing my portfolio this week. I don't want to go into real estate development. I never have. My father's face flushed with a color I'd rarely seen. A dangerous crimson that started at his collar and rose to his temples. We are not paying for you to waste 4 years taking pictures, Emma. That is final. I've applied for scholarships, I countered, and I qualify for financial aid. While living under our roof? With our income? My mother laughed, the sound brittle and without humor. No financial aid office would approve that application. Then I won't live under your roof. The words surprised me as much as them, but once spoken they felt right, like stepping from shadow into sunlight. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the century-old house seemed to hold its breath, waiting. My father recovered first, his expression cooling from anger to something more calculated. If that's your choice, I suggest you start packing. He opened his desk drawer and withdrew his checkbook, the actual paper kind he insisted on using for certain transactions. We've supported you for 18 years, Emma. Food, clothing, private school, that ridiculous darkroom equipment in the basement. That equipment was grandmother's, I corrected. She left it to me specifically. He ignored this, writing with precise strokes. This is the last money you'll receive from us, he said. tearing the check free and sliding it across the immaculate glass surface. $5,000. Use it wisely because there won't be more. I looked at the check without touching it. $5,000. What they spent on my mother's gala dresses for a single season or one business-class ticket to Europe. A pittance compared to what they'd invested in Ethan's education and career, yet presented as extraordinary generosity. Your grandmother would be disappointed by your choices, my mother added, her voice carrying that particular sting she'd perfected over years, the invocation of my beloved grandmother's opinion as a weapon. Maggie might have encouraged your artistic hobbies, but she understood family responsibilities. Why else would she have left Oakwood entirely to us instead? Of splitting it between her grandchildren? I'd often wondered that myself, though I'd never voiced the question. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Grandmother Maggie and I had shared a bond over our love for Oakwood's history and architectural significance. She'd taught me photography on her vintage Leica, showed me how to develop film in the basement darkroom, encouraged my documentation of the estate's details. Yet when she passed, her will had reportedly left everything to my parents, a decision that had confused me deeply. Maggie was practical in the end, my father said, misreading my silence. She knew who would make responsible decisions about this property's future. I finally reached for the check, folding it carefully before tucking it into my pocket. If responsible means destroying everything that made this place special, then I'm glad to be irresponsible. I stood, suddenly eager to be anywhere but this sterile room that so perfectly represented my parents' disconnection from Oakwood's soul. I'll be out by tonight. Emma, my mother sighed, her exasperation tinged with performative concern. Don't be dramatic. Just complete the Wharton application and we can put this unpleasantness behind us. But something had crystallized within me, a clarity I hadn't possessed before entering the study. Perhaps it was the culmination of years of having my passions dismissed, or maybe it was the specific callousness of their willingness to discard me over an application. Either way, I knew with absolute certainty that remaining would require sacrificing essential parts of myself. I need to pack, I said simply, walking past my mother without waiting for a response. Upstairs in my bedroom, the only space besides the dark room that truly felt like mine, I moved with unexpected efficiency. Clothing, photography equipment, portfolio materials, the few keepsakes from grandmother that I'd managed to claim after her passing. I was ruthlessly practical about what would fit in my car, a second-hand Volvo wagon that had been grandmother's before she stopped driving. As I sorted through my belongings, my phone buzzed with a text from my brother. SOS from Mom. What the hell is happening on my way back from town? I hesitated, then typed, "Ask them. I'm leaving. Their choice." Ethan appeared in my doorway 20 minutes later, his weekend casual attire, designer jeans and cashmere sweater, somehow still looking like a banker's uniform. "They said you're throwing away your future for an art hobby. True?" "That's their interpretation," I replied, carefully wrapping my camera lenses in soft cloths. "I'd say I'm pursuing my actual interests instead of fulfilling their corporate dynasty fantasies." Ethan leaned against the doorframe, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair, a gesture that momentarily made him look younger than 24. Don't do this. Just apply to Wharton. You don't have to go, but it'll buy you time." Time for what? More negotiations where I always lose? More lectures about responsibility while they tear down another historic building for profit? I sealed a box of darkroom materials with packing tape. I'm done pretending, Ethan. I've been doing it my whole life to keep the peace. "Where will you even go?" he asked, his voice softening into the genuine concern he occasionally allowed himself to show when our parents weren't around. "Sophia's offered her couch for now." My best friend's tiny Cambridge apartment wasn't ideal, but it was a starting point. "I'll figure it out from there." "Let me help," he offered, reaching for his wallet. "I can give you—" "No," I interrupted firmly. "I don't want their money and I don't want yours. I need to do this myself." He studied me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between admiration and concern. "You're serious about this, about photography?" "I always have been," I said, sealing the final box. "You all just weren't listening." What followed was a blur of activity. Loading my car under the disapproving watch of my mother from the front door, a tense exchange with my father who reiterated that my decision was permanent and irrevocable, a brief, awkward hug from Ethan, who slipped me his credit card despite my protests. "Emergency use only. Promise me." And then I was standing on the circular drive of Oakwood Estate, watching my father's Mercedes disappear toward town, bearing both my parents to an evening charity function that apparently took precedence over their daughter's departure. The sprawling Victorian loomed behind me, its turrets and gables outlined against the autumn sky, windows reflecting the late afternoon sunlight like knowing eyes. "I'll come back for you," I whispered to the house, a promise to both the building and myself. Though how I would ever return to a place my parents owned, I couldn't imagine. I couldn't know then that Grandmother Maggie had set events in motion long before this day, arrangements that would bring me back to Oakwood sooner than anyone expected, with the power to protect what she and I had both loved. As I drove away, from the only home I'd ever known, I felt a curious mixture of terror and exhilaration. For the first time in my life, the weight of my parents' expectations had lifted, replaced by the dizzying vertigo of unlimited possibility, and the very real pressure of survival on my own terms. My new life began in Sophia Chen's cluttered one-bedroom apartment near Central Square in Cambridge. The couch was lumpy, the space barely sufficient for one person, let alone two, but Sophia's welcome was warm and uncomplicated. "They actually kicked you out?" she asked that first night, cross-legged on her bed while I arranged my makeshift sleeping space. "Because you want to study photography instead of making millions destroying beautiful old buildings like your dad? That's next-level control freak behavior." "They'd call it maintaining standards," I replied, smoothing a sheet over the couch cushions. "The Mitchell family doesn't do creative careers. We do practical, profitable professions with clear advancement, trajectories and retirement plans, preferably with executive in the title." "Says who?" Sophia snorted, adjusting her bright blue-framed glasses. "Your grandmother was a photographer too, wasn't she? I've seen her work at that gallery downtown." It was true. Maggie Wright Mitchell had been known in certain circles for her documentary photography of historic New England architecture in the 1970s and 80s, though my parents rarely acknowledged this part of her life. They preferred to remember her as the proper society wife of my late grandfather, glossing over her artistic pursuits as eccentric hobbies rather than the respected career they'd actually been. "Grandmother was different," I said, arranging the few personal items I'd brought on Sophia's coffee table. My favorite lens, a small wooden box containing vintage camera filters Maggie had given me, and the framed photograph of us together, on Oakwood's porch swing on my 16th birthday. She had family money of her own. They couldn't control her the way they've always controlled me. "Well, now they can't control you either," Sophia pointed out. "Silver lining?" I managed a smile, though the reality of my situation was beginning to sink in. $5,000 wouldn't last long in Boston. I needed income, affordable housing, and a plan for school. The RISD application was submitted, but even with potential scholarships, the cost would be substantial. "One day at a time," I said, as much to myself as to Sophia. "Tomorrow, I look for jobs." The next morning, reality arrived with brutal efficiency. A quick assessment of my finances revealed the uncomfortable truth. Even with careful budgeting, my savings and my parents' parting gift would last 3 months at most. Entry-level positions that would hire an 18-year-old with no college degree offered barely enough to cover basic expenses, let alone save for tuition. After a week of increasingly desperate online job searches, I found myself standing outside, a nondescript brick building in Boston's Fort Point neighborhood, clutching a carefully curated portfolio of my best work. The faded sign beside the industrial door read simply, Rodriguez Visual Documentation. Jackson Rodriguez was something of a legend in photography circles, a documentary photographer whose architectural studies had been featured in National Geographic, the New York Times, and major museum exhibitions. His work chronicling the disappearance of historic structures throughout America had sparked preservation movements in several cities. He rarely took on assistance, but the cryptic job posting I'd found mentioned a need for someone with attention to architectural detail and darkroom proficiency, a description that seemed tailored to my specific skills. The man who opened the door to my tentative knock was not what I'd expected. Instead of the austere artistic type I'd imagined, Jackson Rodriguez was a burly, bearded figure in his mid-30s, dressed in faded jeans and a flannel shirt, with laugh lines around his eyes and an easy manner that immediately put me at ease. "You must be Emma," he said, gesturing me inside the converted warehouse space that served as both studio and living quarters. "Right on time? I like that." The interview that followed was unlike any I'd prepared for. Rather than asking about my experience or references, Jack, as he immediately insisted I call him, led me to a light table where dozens of negatives were arranged. "Sort these by architectural period," he instructed, watching as I carefully examined each image. I worked methodically, arranging the negatives into distinct categories: colonial, federal, Greek Revival, Victorian, craftsman, Art Deco, modernist. When I hesitated over a particular image of what appeared to be a mixed period structure, I placed it between categories, explaining, "The facade shows Greek Revival elements, but the window treatments and interior staircase visible here are distinctly Victorian, likely an 1860s renovation of an earlier structure." Jack's eyebrows rose slightly. "Most applicants don't catch that," he noted, a hint of approval in his voice. "Where'd you learn to read buildings that way?" "My grandmother," I answered honestly. "She photographed historic architecture and taught me to see beyond superficial details to understand a building's evolution. We had a game where we'd walk through neighborhoods and try to date houses just by their architectural elements." Next, he led me to the darkroom, where he challenged me to develop a roll of black and white film without instructions. The familiar chemical scents and red safety light felt like coming home after a long absence. My fingers remembered the procedures. Grandmother had taught me in Oakwood's basement darkroom: the precise timing, the gentle agitation of the developing tank, the careful handling of wet negatives. When we emerged with perfectly developed film, Jack leaned against the counter and fixed me with a direct gaze. "Why do you want this job, Emma? And don't give me the standard interview answer. I need the truth." So I told him about growing up in a house my parents viewed as a commodity rather than a home with history, about my determination to document and preserve architectural heritage, about being cut off for choosing photography over real estate development. I showed him my portfolio, including my systematic documentation of Oakwood's unique architectural elements, explaining my technique for capturing not just the visual aspects, but the emotional resonance of historic spaces. When I finished, Jack was silent for a long moment, studying my portfolio pages with careful attention. Finally, he closed the leather binder and handed it back to me. "The position pays $22 an hour, with potential for more when you assist on commercial jobs," he said without preamble. "Hours can be irregular, sometimes all night when we're on deadline, sometimes nothing for days when I'm traveling. You'll help with shoots, manage the darkroom, catalog the archive, and handle basic office administration. I need someone who can think independently and doesn't need constant direction." He paused. "Can you start tomorrow?" Just like that, my first real job materialized. offering not just income but the opportunity to learn from someone whose work I'd admired for years. As I left Jack's studio that afternoon, the weight of uncertainty lifted slightly. I had direction now, a foothold in the world I wanted to inhabit. What I didn't realize was how quickly that world would expand, or that Jack Rodriguez's mentorship would lead me back to Oakwood in ways I couldn't have imagined, armed with knowledge, purpose, and the legal means to save the legacy my grandmother had entrusted to me without my knowledge. 3 weeks into my new position, as I cataloged Jack's extensive archive of New England architectural photography, I discovered something unexpected: an entire section dedicated to Oakwood Estate dating from the mid-1970s. Dozens of meticulously documented images showed the property during my grandmother's early restoration efforts, along with her handwritten notes about original materials, construction techniques, and historical significance. "You knew my grandmother," I said, when Jack returned from a shooting assignment that evening. He set down his equipment bags, his expression thoughtful. "Maggie Wright Mitchell was my first mentor," he confirmed. "She gave me my start in architectural documentation when no one else would take a chance on a community college kid with no connections. I photographed Oakwood with her for almost 2 years during its restoration." "She never mentioned you," I said, confused by this missing piece of family history. Jack's laugh held a hint of sadness. "I'm not surprised. Your parents made it clear they disapproved of Maggie's preservation work and her association with artistic types like me. After your grandfather died, they pushed hard for her to sell Oakwood to developers. When she refused," he shrugged. "Let's just say family gatherings became complicated. This revelation opened a door to understanding the tension I'd always sensed between my grandmother and my parents, a fundamental disagreement about value and legacy that went beyond mere aesthetic preferences. It also explained why Jack had hired me so readily. He'd seen my grandmother's influence in my work, recognized a continuation of her vision. "There's something else you should know," Jack said carefully. "Something Maggie told me before she passed away. I've been waiting for the right time to bring it up." He retrieved a business card from his desk drawer and handed it to me. "Daniel Cooper, historic preservation attorney," it read, with an office address in downtown Boston. "Call him," Jack advised. "Maggie arranged for you to meet with him when you turned 18. I think you'll find it illuminating." The meeting with Daniel Cooper 3 days later would alter the course of my life as dramatically as being cut off by my parents had done. The silver-haired attorney welcomed me into his office with the warm familiarity of someone who'd been waiting for this moment. "Emma Mitchell," he said, clasping my hand in both of his. "You look remarkably like your grandmother at your age. Same determination in the eyes." Over the next hour, Cooper explained what my parents, and I, had never known: the documents. He spread across his desk told a story that contradicted everything I'd been told about Oakwood's ownership. "Your grandmother never left the estate to your parents," Cooper explained, indicating the complex legal papers before us. "She created a historic preservation trust with very specific terms. Your parents were granted lifetime residential rights to Oakwood, but the property itself, along with a substantial maintenance fund, was placed in trust with you named as trustee upon your 18th birthday." I stared at him, struggling to process this information. "That can't be right. They've been making plans to modify the property. They're scheduled to demolish the carriage house next month for luxury guest cottages." Cooper's expression sharpened. "Any significant alterations or demolition of original structures would constitute a breach of the trust terms," he said, flipping to a specific section of the document. "The carriage house in particular is specifically protected under paragraph 8, which prohibits any alteration to the historic outbuildings that contribute to the property's architectural integrity." "They don't know," I whispered, the realization dawning. "My parents have no idea these restrictions exist." "Your grandmother had concerns about their development plans," Cooper confirmed. "She arranged for this trust quietly, with the papers to be executed upon her death. Your parents were informed only that they had lifetime residential rights, but the full terms were to be disclosed to you alone when you turned 18. He smiled slightly. Maggie was protecting Oakwood's future the only way she could, by placing it in the hands of the person who loved it as she did. The implications were staggering. Not only was I the legal trustee of Oakwood Estate, with authority over any structural changes, but the trust included funds specifically designated for preservation and maintenance. My parents had been operating under the mistaken belief that they owned the property outright, making plans that directly violated the trust's provisions. "There's more," Cooper added, producing another document. "The trust includes a significant educational fund for you, dedicated to studies in historic preservation, architecture, or related fields. Maggie was quite specific about supporting your education in these areas." I thought of the RISD application I'd submitted, the program in architectural photography I'd been so drawn to, and felt a wave of gratitude for my grandmother's foresight. She'd created a path for me even when she could no longer be present to guide me directly. "What happens now?" I asked, the weight of responsibility settling alongside a growing sense of purpose. "That's entirely up to you," Cooper replied. "As trustee, you have the legal authority to enforce the preservation requirements, including halting any demolition or inappropriate renovations. You could take immediate action regarding the carriage house plans." I sat back in my chair, considering my options. The revelation gave me power I hadn't anticipated, but wielding it required careful consideration. My parents had dismissed my concerns about Oakwood's preservation for years, treating my attachment to the property's historic character as childish sentimentality. Now, I had the legal authority to protect what they'd been planning to destroy, but at what cost to our already fractured relationship? "I need time to think," I told Cooper, "to decide the best approach." He nodded, gathering the documents into a folder that he handed to me. "Your grandmother believed you would make the right decisions when the time came. For what it's worth, I think she was correct." As I left his office, Boston's autumn sunlight cast long shadows across the historic buildings of Beacon Hill. Structures that had survived centuries of change through the deliberate choices of those who valued their presence. In my hands, I held the means to ensure Oakwood would join them in preservation rather than memory. That evening, I sat on Sophia's fire escape, the trust document spread around me, contemplating my next move. The scheduled demolition of the carriage house was 3 weeks away, enough time to intervene but requiring swift action. Simply informing my parents of the trust's existence would likely trigger immediate legal challenges and bitter conflict. Yet allowing the demolition to proceed would betray both my grandmother's intentions and my own values. My phone buzzed, with a text from Ethan. "Parents in full renovation mode. Demolition crew doing prep work at carriage house. You okay? Haven't heard from you." I stared at the message, the parallel paths before me crystallizing into a single clear direction. I would protect Oakwood, but not through confrontation and legal threats. Instead, I would use my grandmother's gift as she had intended, as a tool for preservation through transformation, creating something that honored history while serving the present. The plan that formed over the next days was ambitious but achievable with the resources now available to me. Instead of simply blocking my parents' development plans, I would present an alternative vision for Oakwood, one that would preserve its historical integrity while creating a sustainable future for the property. The carriage house wouldn't be demolished. It would be repurposed as the centerpiece of a new educational facility dedicated to architectural preservation and documentation. With Jack's guidance and Cooper's legal assistance, I began assembling the elements necessary to execute this vision. The Trust's educational funds would cover my tuition at RISD, where I could develop the skills needed to document Oakwood's transformation. The preservation funds would finance the appropriate restoration of the carriage house and other historic structures on the property. 4 days before the scheduled demolition, I called my brother. "Ethan, I need to meet with you and Mom and Dad at Oakwood. It's important. They're still pretty raw about you leaving," he warned. "Dad especially." "Tell them it's about the carriage house demolition," I said. "Tell them I have information they need to hear before it proceeds." He hesitated. "Is this going to make things worse?" "That depends on their willingness to listen," I replied. "But either way, this meeting needs to happen." The stage was set for my return to Oakwood, not as the dismissed daughter crawling back in defeat, but as the rightful trustee of my grandmother's legacy, armed with both legal authority and a vision for the future that could either heal our family divisions or deepen them irreparably. As I prepared to face my parents across the chasm of misunderstanding and conflicting values that had defined our relationship for years, I remembered my grandmother's words, spoken during our last photography session in Oakwood's garden. "Buildings, like families, require both solid foundations and the flexibility to adapt to changing times. The ones that survive are those that find balance between preservation and evolution." I was about to discover whether our family could achieve that balance, or if Oakwood's preservation would come at the cost of any hope for reconciliation. Either way, the naive, compliant Emma who had left Oakwood a month ago was gone. In her place stood someone prepared to fight for what mattered, with strategies my parents hadn't anticipated and resources they didn't know existed. The October morning dawned crisp and clear as I drove through the wrought iron gates of Oakwood Estate for the first time since my departure. The maples lining the curved driveway blazed in autumn splendor, their fiery canopy creating a tunnel of gold and crimson that had always marked the season's peak at the estate. 4 weeks had transformed me, but Oakwood remained timeless. The Victorian Grande Dame standing proudly against the blue Massachusetts sky, her turrets and gables exactly as they had been for over a century. I parked my Volvo beside my father's Mercedes and my brother's Audi, noting the construction equipment already positioned near the carriage house, a grim reminder of what I'd returned to prevent. Daniel Cooper's sedan pulled in behind me, his presence a reassuring anchor as I prepared for the confrontation ahead. "Remember," he said as we gathered our materials, "you have both the legal authority and the moral high ground. Don't let them rush you or dismiss your proposal." I nodded, clutching the portfolio containing both the trust documents and my alternative plans for Oakwood's future. My hands were steady despite the nervous energy coursing through me. This wasn't the emotional reaction of a wounded daughter. It was the calculated response of someone protecting what mattered. Ethan met us at the front door, his expression a mixture of confusion and concern. "Emma," he embraced me briefly, then glanced at Cooper with undisguised curiosity. "Who's this?" "Daniel Cooper, historic preservation attorney," I said. "He's here to discuss grandmother's trust." Ethan's eyebrows rose. "Trust? What trust? Dad never mentioned—" "That's part of why we're here," I interrupted gently. "There's a lot about Oakwood that hasn't been discussed." My parents waited. In the formal living room, a space my mother had redecorated in sterile whites and grays that clashed with the room's ornate Victorian moldings and mahogany floors. My father stood by the marble fireplace, his posture rigid with barely contained irritation. My mother perched on the edge of an uncomfortable-looking modernist settee, her perfect posture and immaculate appearance a fortress against whatever disruption I represented. "Emma," she acknowledged with a cool nod, then focused on Cooper. "And you are?" Cooper stepped forward, extending his business card with practiced ease. "Daniel Cooper, attorney for the Margaret Wright Mitchell Historic Preservation Trust. I represent the interests of Oakwood Estate and its designated trustee." My father's expression shifted from irritation to sharp attention. There must be some mistake. My mother-in-law left Oakwood to us in her will. We have documentation from her estate attorney. "You were granted lifetime residential rights," Cooper corrected, opening his briefcase to extract a folder of legal documents. But ownership of the property, along with specific preservation requirements, was placed in a separate trust. The full terms were to be disclosed upon the designated trustee's 18th birthday. My mother's fingers tightened around her coffee cup. And who exactly is this mysterious trustee? I am, I said, meeting her gaze directly. Grandmother named me trustee of Oakwood when I turned 18. The property isn't yours to modify, and certainly not yours to demolish. The silence that followed was absolute. My father's face flushed crimson, a vein pulsing at his temple as he processed this reversal. My mother set down her cup with careful precision, the slight tremor in her hands the only indication of her shock. "This is absurd," my father finally sputtered. "Maggie would never—" "It's all legally documented," Cooper interjected smoothly, spreading the trust papers on the coffee table. Margaret Wright Mitchell established the trust 3 years before her death, with specific provisions regarding the property's maintenance and preservation. The carriage house demolition directly violates Section 8, Paragraph 3 of the trust. Terms. My father snatched up the documents, scanning them with growing agitation. "This can't be binding. We've already contracted the demolition crew, secured permits." "Which will need to be canceled," Cooper stated firmly. "Any attempt to proceed with demolition would constitute a breach of the trust's terms and could result in significant legal consequences." Ethan, who had been silently observing this exchange, exhaled slowly. "So you came back just to stop the demolition? To legally block us from improving the property?" The question stung with its implication of petty revenge, but I'd anticipated this reaction. Instead of responding defensively, I opened my portfolio and spread the architectural renderings I'd prepared across the coffee table. "I came back with an alternative," I said, gesturing to the detailed plans. "Not to block improvement, but to offer a different vision for Oakwood's future, one that honors its historical significance while creating sustainable purpose." The renderings showed the carriage house transformed into an architectural preservation center, with the original structure meticulously restored and the interior repurposed as exhibition space, teaching facilities, and a state-of-the-art photography studio. Additional plans detailed the main house's restoration and the grounds rehabilitation, according to historic landscape designs found in my grandmother's archives. The trust includes substantial funds specifically for preservation and appropriate renovation, I explained, gaining confidence as I outlined the vision I'd developed with Jack's guidance. Instead of demolishing historic structures to build luxury cottages, we can create an educational center that celebrates architectural heritage. The carriage house becomes the centerpiece of a facility dedicated to preserving and documenting historic structures through both traditional craftsmanship and modern digital techniques. My mother studied the renderings with narrowed eyes. And who exactly would visit this preservation center? Architectural students? Craftspeople? Specializing in historical restoration, photographers documenting disappearing structures, I listed. There's growing interest in preservation trades, but limited facilities for hands-on education. Oakwood could become a premier destination for specialized workshops and residencies. You're suggesting we turn our private residence into some kind of public museum? My father's disdain was palpable. "The main house remains private," I clarified, pointing to the relevant section of the plans. "Your residential rights are unchanged. The carriage house and surrounding 2 acres would be developed as the center, with scheduled access through the eastern drive to maintain your privacy." Ethan had picked up one of the renderings, studying it with unexpected interest. "This actually looks impressive, Em. You developed all this in the past month?" "With help," I acknowledged. "Jack Rodriguez, the photographer I'm working for, has connections in preservation architecture, and Daniel helped me understand what the trust allows and requires." My father slammed the trust documents down on the table. "This is manipulation. Pure and simple. Maggie must have been declining mentally when she set this up. We'll challenge it in court. Cooper smiled thinly. You're welcome to try, Mr. Mitchell. However, the trust was established with extensive documentation of Margaret's mental competence, including evaluations from 2 independent physicians. Furthermore, challenging it would potentially jeopardize your residential rights, which are contingent upon adherence to the preservation requirements. My mother's gaze shifted between the documents and me, calculation replacing her initial shock. What exactly are you hoping to achieve here, Emma? You walk away from this family, reject our guidance about your education, and now return with some legal maneuver to control property that's been in our care for years? The question deserved a thoughtful answer, one that might bridge the chasm between us rather than widen it. I'm hoping to protect what grandmother valued, I said carefully. Not just the buildings, but what they represent. Craftsmanship, history, continuity. She saw something in me that you've never recognized. Not defiance or impracticality, but a genuine commitment to preservation. This isn't about control. It's about stewardship. Sentimental nonsense, my father muttered, but the declaration lacked his usual conviction. The trust also includes an educational fund, I continued, addressing my mother directly. Specifically for my studies in preservation, architectural photography, and related fields. Grandmother wanted to support my path, even knowing you might not. This revelation visibly impacted her, a flash of something hurt, recognition, crossing her carefully composed features. Maggie never said a word about this to us. Perhaps she tried, I suggested gently. But were you listening? The way you listened when I talked about my photography and my love for this property's history? Ethan cleared his throat, breaking the tense silence that followed. So what? Happens now, legally speaking? Cooper addressed him directly. As trustee, Emma has the authority to halt the carriage house demolition immediately. The contractors can be notified that the project violates the property's legal status. Beyond that, she's proposing a collaborative approach to Oakwood's future development, one that satisfies the trust's requirements while potentially creating something valuable for everyone involved. And if we refuse to collaborate, my father challenged, then we proceed with a strictly legal enforcement of the trust terms, Cooper replied evenly. The demolition stops, but so does any possibility of adaptive reuse of the historic structures. Oakwood remains essentially frozen in its current state, with only maintenance and historically accurate restoration permitted. My mother, ever practical, recognized the implications immediately. So either we work with Emma on her preservation, center concept, or we lose any chance to modify the property at all. Those are the options the trust creates, I confirmed. Grandmother was protecting Oakwood's future, but she left room for thoughtful evolution, if it respects the property's historical integrity. My father paced the length of the living room, his agitation visible in every movement. This man, who had built his career on controlling outcomes and manipulating property values, was confronting a situation where his authority had been fundamentally undermined. Not by external forces, but by his own mother-in-law and daughter. I need to consult our attorney, he finally said. This is too significant to decide without proper legal review. Of course, Cooper agreed smoothly. However, I should note that the scheduled demolition must be canceled immediately, regardless of any further legal consultation. I've prepared the necessary notification documents for the contractors and permit office. He produced another folder containing the requisite paperwork. My father took it with obvious reluctance, scanning the contents with a clenched jaw. You've been planning this for weeks, he accused, looking at me with a mixture of anger and something that might have been grudging respect. All while we thought you were just having some emotional reaction to being cut off. I've been reclaiming my voice, I corrected, and honoring grandmother's legacy the way she asked me to. I gathered the architectural renderings, returning them to my portfolio. Review the trust documents with your attorney, Think about the Preservation Center proposal. I'll return tomorrow to discuss next steps." As Cooper and I prepared to leave, Ethan followed us to the door. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I think grandmother knew exactly what she was doing when she made you trustee. You're the only one of us who ever really saw Oakwood." His words stayed with me as we drove away from the estate, the autumn painted, trees a blur through the car window. For years, I'd believed my appreciation for Oakwood's history and architectural significance was a personal quirk, dismissed by my family as impractical sentimentality. Now I understood it had been preparation for a responsibility my grandmother had always intended for me. "Round one complete," Cooper remarked as we turned onto the main road. They reacted exactly as expected. "My father will fight this," I warned. "He doesn't surrender control easily." "Perhaps. But he's also a businessman who recognizes when the cost of fighting exceeds the potential gain." Cooper glanced at me with approval. "Your proposal gives them a face-saving alternative to outright capitulation. That was smartly done." At Jack's studio that evening, I recounted the confrontation, still processing my parents' reactions and the strange power shift that had occurred in that formal living room where I'd spent so many uncomfortable family gatherings. "Maggie would have enjoyed that scene," Jack chuckled, adjusting his camera equipment for the next day's shoot. "She always said your father was too used to getting his own way." It felt surreal, I admitted. 1 month ago, I was the disappointing daughter being lectured about responsibility. Today, I'm the one with legal authority over the property they thought was theirs. "The question is what you'll do with that authority," Jack observed. "Real power isn't about control. It's about vision, creating something others couldn't imagine until you show them the possibility." His words echoed in my mind as I returned to Sophia's apartment, where I'd continue to stay until my next steps became clear. The confrontation at Oakwood had altered something fundamental in my relationship with my parents. Whether that alteration would lead to positive transformation or permanent estrangement remained to be seen, but the direction now lay largely in my hands. My phone buzzed with a text from Ethan. "Dad's been on the phone with attorneys all evening, but he just canceled the demolition. I think your plan might actually work." A small victory, but significant. The carriage house would stand, at least for now. Tomorrow would bring new negotiations and challenges, but the first crucial step had been taken. Oakwood's future as a preserved historic estate, rather than another victim of development, was suddenly possible in ways it hadn't been 24 hours earlier. True to expectation, my father had marshaled his legal resources overnight. When I returned to Oakwood the following morning, a corporate attorney from his development company accompanied my parents in the dining room, where architectural plans and legal documents now covered the antique mahogany table that had served generations of my mother's family. "Ms. Mitchell," the attorney greeted me with professional courtesy. "I'm Howard Levinson, counsel for Mitchell Development. I've reviewed the trust documents provided by Mr. Cooper, and while there are certain aspects we may wish to challenge, we're prepared to discuss a compromise regarding the carriage house project." I took the seat opposite him, maintaining the calm composure I'd learned from watching Cooper. "I'm listening, Mr. Levinson." "The current development plan will be withdrawn," he stated. "However, my clients propose an alternative that would satisfy both their interests and the trust's preservation requirements. Instead of demolition, the carriage house would be renovated as a single luxury residence, maintaining its historic exterior while modernizing the interior." I studied the modified plans he slid across the table. The proposal preserved the carriage house's shell but gutted everything inside, replacing hand-hewn beams with steel supports, historic brick with insulated drywall, original slate roofing, with modern materials designed to look historic from a distance. "This doesn't meet the trust standards for preservation," I said, pushing the plans back toward him. Section 8 specifically protects interior architectural elements, including the exposed beam structure, brick walls, and original flooring. My father leaned forward. "Be reasonable, Emma. The trust requires preservation, not mummification. The building needs updating to be functional in the 21st century. Functional for what purpose? I asked. As another luxury property for short-term rentals? Or as something that serves both preservation and education? I opened my portfolio and removed a document I'd prepared with Cooper's assistance, a preliminary business plan for the Oakwood Preservation Center. The projections showed operational costs, potential revenue streams from workshops and residencies, and grant opportunities available for historic preservation projects. This is a viable alternative, I explained, indicating the financial analysis. One that honors both Oakwood's history and its potential future. The carriage house becomes not just a preserved building, but a living workshop where preservation skills are taught and practiced. The attorney examined the document with professional skepticism. These projections seem optimistic. Historic preservation isn't exactly a growth industry. Actually, it is, I countered, prepared for this objection. Traditional building crafts are experiencing a renaissance as people recognize the environmental and cultural value of preserving existing structures. The market for specialized workshops in historic restoration techniques has grown 20% annually for the past 5 years. I'd done my research thoroughly, assisted by Jack's connections in the preservation community. The statistics were accurate and compelling, something my businessman father would respect, even if he disagreed with my vision. The trust provides initial funding, I continued, but the center would be self-sustaining within 3 years through workshop fees, artist residencies, and preservation consulting services. My mother, who had been uncharacteristically quiet until now, studied me with newfound attention. "You've thought this through more carefully than I expected," she observed, her tone neutral, but lacking its usual dismissiveness. "I inherited grandmother's attention to detail," I replied, allowing myself a small smile, along with her appreciation for Oakwood's significance. Ethan, who had been silently observing from the sidelines, joined the conversation unexpectedly. "What role do you see for the family in this preservation center? Would we just continue living in the main house while strangers conduct workshops 50 yards away?" It was a fair question, one I'd anticipated but hadn't fully resolved. The tension between Oakwood as private residence and public educational facility would require careful navigation. "That's something we need to determine together," I acknowledged. "The trust grants you residential rights to the main house, but it also establishes preservation of the entire estate as the primary objective. Ideally, the center would operate with minimal impact on your daily lives, while potentially offering opportunities for meaningful involvement if you're interested." "Involvement?" my father scoffed. "In what? Teaching people how to restore Victorian gingerbread trim? Or in documenting the property's transformation?" I suggested. "Or developing the business model for sustainable operation. Your expertise in property development could be valuable in creating something that's both historically authentic and financially viable." The suggestion visibly caught him off guard, that I might see value in his professional skills rather than simply opposing everything he represented. For a moment, his reflexive hostility faltered. "The financial aspects would need extensive review," he said, more thoughtfully than I'd expected. "Historic properties are notorious money pits without proper business planning, which is precisely why the center could be valuable," I pointed out. "Teaching the business of preservation alongside the craft skills, helping people understand how to make historic restoration economically sustainable." For the next 2 hours, we delved into increasingly detailed discussions of what the preservation center might entail, how it would operate alongside the family's residence, and what role each person might play in its development. My father's resistance gradually shifted from outright opposition to critical analysis, challenging specifics while grudgingly acknowledging the concept's potential merit. By early afternoon, we had reached a tentative agreement. The carriage house demolition would be permanently canceled, replaced by a graduated restoration plan that would transform it into the center's primary facility over the next 18 months. My parents would retain their residence in the main house, with clear boundaries established between public and private areas of the estate. I would serve as the project's director, overseeing both the restoration work and the development of educational programming. "There's one more thing," I said as the meeting drew to a close. "The trust includes an educational stipend specifically for my studies in preservation and architectural photography. I've been accepted to RISD's program, and I intend to enroll for the spring semester." My mother's expression tightened. "So you'll be managing this ambitious project while attending art school? That seems impractical." "The program is partly online," I explained, "and my coursework will directly support the center's development, documentation techniques, preservation theory, architectural history. It's not a distraction from the project, it's preparation for it." My father studied me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher, something between resignation and reluctant respect. "Your grandmother engineered this quite thoroughly, didn't she? The trust, the educational fund, the timing of disclosure. She made sure you'd have options we couldn't control." "She made sure Oakwood would be protected," I corrected gently. "By someone who values what makes it special. That happens to be me." As I gathered my materials to leave, Ethan walked me to my car, autumn leaves crunching beneath our feet on the gravel drive. "You've changed," he observed, hands in his pockets against the October chill. "A month ago, you would have been defensive, emotional. Today you negotiated like one of us." "Is that a compliment?" I asked, unable to keep the edge from my voice. "Actually, yes." He leaned against my car, his expression sincere. "You were always the family's conscience, Em. The one who pointed out the historic buildings we were demolishing, the craftsmanship we were discarding. But you used to do it with righteous anger that was easy to dismiss. Now you're speaking a language Dad actually understands. Plans, projections, viable alternatives." His observation struck me as surprisingly insightful. I had changed in the weeks since leaving Oakwood, developed a strategic approach to advocacy, rather than merely protesting what I opposed. Jack's mentorship had shown me how to channel passion into effective action, to document and present alternatives rather than simply criticizing existing plans. "Will you move back?" Ethan asked suddenly. "Now that you're in charge of the property's future?" I considered the question carefully. Returning to Oakwood as its trustee would be significantly different from living there as the dismissed daughter. I would have authority, purpose, legal standing. But the dynamics with my parents would remain complex, the potential for conflict ever present. "Not immediately," I decided. "I'll continue working with Jack while overseeing the initial restoration planning. Once construction begins on the carriage house conversion, I'll need to be here more regularly. But by then, my role will be clearly established. It's better to maintain some separation for now." Ethan nodded, understanding the wisdom of this approach. "They're going to test boundaries, especially Dad. He's not used to operating under someone else's authority, let alone his teenage daughters." "I'm aware," I said dryly. "That's why the trust terms are so specific. Grandmother knew exactly what protections Oakwood would need." As I drove away from the estate for the second time, my emotions were markedly different from the day I'd left with a suitcase and wounded pride. This departure felt like the beginning rather than an ending, the first step in a transformation that would affect not just Oakwood's physical structures, but the family relationships that had developed within its walls. Jack was waiting at the studio when I returned, curious about the outcome of the negotiations. I recounted the tentative agreement, still processing the strange new dynamic with my parents. "They didn't fight as hard as I expected," I concluded, helping him sort negatives from his latest documentary project, a series on repurposed industrial buildings in New England mill towns. "People like your father respond to strength," Jack observed, holding a negative up to the light. "For years, they saw your passion for preservation as a weakness, impractical idealism. Now you've demonstrated it can be a form of power. That, changes the equation. Power isn't what I wanted, I admitted, carefully placing sorted negatives into archival sleeves. I just wanted Oakwood to survive intact, to have its history respected. Jack smiled, the expression crinkling the corners of his eyes behind his glasses. Welcome to preservation work, Emma. It's never just about buildings. It's about the values they represent and the battles needed to protect them. Maggie understood that. It's why she set things up the way she did. Over the next weeks, the Oakwood project began taking concrete form. I divided my time between Jack's studio, where I continued learning the craft of architectural documentation, and the estate, where architects specializing in historic preservation assessed the carriage house's condition and developed detailed restoration plans. My father, reluctantly acknowledging the inevitability of the preservation approach, gradually shifted from opposition to critical engagement, questioning methods, challenging cost estimates, demanding justification for specific restoration choices. Though sometimes exhausting, his scrutiny actually strengthened the project, forcing us to articulate clear rationales for preservation decisions rather than relying on aesthetic preferences alone. My mother's adjustment proved more surprising. After initially maintaining cool distance from the project, she unexpectedly appeared one afternoon as I photographed original hardware from the carriage house doors, intricate iron hinges and latches crafted by a local blacksmith in the 1890s. "Your grandmother used to do that," she observed, watching me position the pieces against neutral backgrounds to document their details. Spend hours photographing what most people would consider insignificant elements of the house. "These aren't insignificant," I replied, adjusting my camera settings. "They're the craftsmanship that defined the era. Handmade pieces that tell us about both the technical capabilities and design preferences of their time." Instead of the dismissive response I'd expected, my mother studied the ironwork with newfound attention. "I never really looked at them before," she admitted. "All these years living here, and I saw fixtures that needed polishing, not artifacts with history." The comment revealed a potential opening, a willingness to see Oakwood differently than she had before. Over subsequent weeks, this shift gradually expanded as she began asking questions about restoration techniques, examining archive photos of the estate from my grandmother's collection, even offering insights about period-appropriate textiles based on her interior design background. By early December, with the first phase of carriage house restoration underway, a tentative new family dynamic had emerged. Not the reconciliation of movie script fantasies, but a cautious accommodation based on shared investment in Oakwood's transformation. We remained different people with fundamentally different values, but we had found common ground in the physical space we all, in our own ways, considered home. My RISD acceptance for the spring semester arrived in mid-December, completing the path my grandmother had envisioned. Education supporting preservation, theory informing practice, the next generation building on the foundation she had established. The program would allow me to develop my documentation skills while directly applying them to Oakwood's ongoing restoration, creating a comprehensive record of both what was being preserved and how the preservation was accomplished. On the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year, I stood in the partially restored carriage house as late afternoon sunlight streamed through newly repaired windows, illuminating exposed beams that had been hidden behind drywall for decades. The space smelled of old wood, linseed oil, and possibility, a structure moving simultaneously backward toward its authentic historic character and forward toward new purpose. My phone buzzed with a text from Ethan. "Parents requesting your presence for dinner at the main house. 7 p.m., semi-formal, grandmother's birthday." I had almost forgotten. December 21st would have been Maggie's 85th birthday. In previous years, we'd observed it with obligatory cake and uncomfortable reminiscences limited to Maggie's socially acceptable achievements. This invitation suggested something different, an acknowledgement, perhaps, of connections deeper than we had previously recognized. As I prepared to lock up the carriage house for the evening, I noticed something on the newly exposed brick wall that had been revealed during restoration. Faint pencil markings in my grandmother's distinctive handwriting. Dates and measurements, but also a brief note. For Emma, who sees what others miss. She had known, even years earlier, that I would be the one to uncover these hidden aspects of Oakwood, to value what had been concealed beneath modernization and neglect. The discovery felt like a confirmation, a message across time affirming the path I'd found myself walking. That evening, as I approached the main house for what would be a pivotal family gathering, I carried with me not just my grandmother's written validation, but a growing confidence in my role as Oakwood's guardian. Whatever challenges lay ahead, with my parents, with the restoration project, with balancing education and responsibility, I faced them now not as the dismissed daughter, seeking approval, but as the rightful trustee honoring a legacy that had been entrusted specifically to me. The transformation of Oakwood Estate had begun with the carriage house restoration, but the more profound renovation was occurring in the relationships and understanding of those connected to the property. Like the historic structures we were carefully restoring, these human connections required patience, skilled attention to original elements worth preserving, and thoughtful adaptation to serve present needs without sacrificing essential character. As I reached for the brass doorknob of my childhood home, now my responsibility rather than merely my residence, I understood that I was crossing a threshold in more ways than one. The Emma who had left in anger and hurt would never return. In her place stood someone with both the legal authority and personal conviction to shape Oakwood's future. The inevitable challenges ahead would test this newfound strength, but for the first time, I felt equal to whatever confrontations awaited. On the other side of that ornately carved door, I paused in the entrance hall, momentarily disoriented by the changes my mother had made during my absence. The antique console table that had graced the foyer for decades, hand-carved walnut with marble top that my grandmother had lovingly restored, had been replaced by a sleek contemporary piece of chrome and glass. The Persian carpet, worn in places but rich with history, was gone, leaving polished floors that reflected the chandelier light with cold brilliance. Emma? My mother appeared from the dining room, dressed in a charcoal sheath dress that probably cost more than a month's rent at Sophia's apartment. Her expression was carefully neutral, neither welcoming nor hostile. "You're right on time." "I brought this," I said, offering the bottle of wine I'd selected with Jack's assistance, a vintage my grandmother had favored on special occasions. "For the celebration." Something flickered in my mother's eyes as she accepted it. "Thank you. Your father and Ethan are already in the dining room." I followed her through the familiar pathway of my childhood home, noting other changes. Artwork replaced, furniture rearranged, all trending toward the minimalist aesthetic my mother had always preferred, but my grandmother had resisted. Dining room, however, retained its essential character, dominated by the massive mahogany table that had hosted Mitchell family gatherings for generations. My father rose as I entered, a formal courtesy that felt strangely performative. "Emma," he acknowledged with a nod. "You're looking well." "Preservation work agrees with me," I replied, taking the seat Ethan had pulled out for me, directly across from my father, a positioning that felt symbolic of our ongoing negotiations. The table was set with my grandmother's Limoges china and sterling silver flatware, items usually reserved for significant occasions. Crystal goblets caught the light from the candelabra centerpiece, creating prisms on the white tablecloth. Whatever this dinner represented, my parents had deemed it worthy of the full formal treatment. "The carriage house restoration seems to be progressing," my father commented as the first course was served by the catering staff my mother had evidently hired for the evening. "The historical architect you brought in appears competent." From him, this constituted high praise. "Edward Cameron is the best in the region for Victorian-era structures," I confirmed. He apprenticed with the craftsman who restored Fairmont. House in Newport. I've been reviewing the preliminary business plan for the education center. My father continued, his tone measured. The projected attendance figures seem optimistic. This was familiar territory, his method of testing my command of details and my confidence in the project's viability. I'd come prepared. They're based on comparable programs at Winterthur and the North Bennett Street School, I explained. Adjusted for our specific location and focus. We've already received inquiries from 3 universities about potential field programs in historic documentation and restoration techniques. My father nodded, conceding the point without explicit acknowledgement, his typical approach when my preparation exceeded his expectations. The initial capital outlay remains significant. The trust provisions are adequate for the restoration phase, I countered, and we've identified 3 grant opportunities for the educational programming development. Throughout this exchange, my mother had remained uncharacteristically silent, observing our conversation with an intensity I couldn't quite interpret. Ethan, too, watched with interest, his gaze moving between us as if tracking a tennis match with significant stakes. When the main course arrived, wild mushroom risotto that had been my grandmother's favorite, my mother finally spoke. This would have been Maggie's 85th birthday. I know, I said quietly. I've been thinking about her all day. We found something, she continued, reaching for a leather folder beside her place setting. When the restoration crew removed the built-in cabinetry in the library, it was sealed in the wall, apparently. She slid the folder across the table to me. Inside was a collection of photographs I'd never seen before. My grandmother as a young woman, standing proudly beside the carriage house. Additional images documented the property throughout different seasons and years, creating a visual timeline of Oakwood's evolution under her stewardship. There was a letter with them, my mother added, her voice carefully controlled. Addressed to you. She handed me an envelope, yellowed with age, with "For Emma when the time comes," written in my grandmother's distinctive handwriting. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it, unfolding the delicate stationery imprinted with Oakwood's letterhead. My dearest Emma, I read silently, the familiar handwriting bringing an unexpected lump to my throat. If you're reading this, then you've discovered your inheritance and begun the work I always knew would be yours. Oakwood has stood for over a century, witnessing the evolution of our family through generations. Now its future rests with you, the only one who truly sees its value beyond property assessments and market trends. Your parents will resist, of course. They see progress and tradition as opposing forces rather than complementary elements of a balanced life. But you, my darling girl, have always understood what they could not. That preserving our history doesn't mean rejecting our future. It means building upon foundations that have proven their strength through time. The trust I've established gives you the legal authority to protect Oakwood, but the vision must be yours. Create something that honors the past while serving the present. Make Oakwood live again in ways that matter. The carriage house holds special significance. It was my first restoration project on the property, the place where I taught you to see architectural details that others overlooked. Begin there, and the path forward will reveal itself. Remember always that buildings, like people, need both roots and wings to thrive. Oakwood's roots are deep. Now you must give it wings. With all my love and confidence, Grandmother Maggie. I carefully refolded the letter, my eyes burning with unshed tears. The timing of its discovery, on her birthday, in the midst of the carriage house restoration, felt like her hand reaching across time, confirming the path I'd chosen. What does it say? Ethan asked gently. That she trusted me to find a way forward for Oakwood, I summarized, not yet ready to share the letter's intimate guidance. That preservation and progress aren't mutually exclusive. My father set down his fork with deliberate precision. Your grandmother was more strategic than I gave her credit for. This trust arrangement, the letter, the timing of it all. She orchestrated this years ago. She knew what would happen if she didn't, I said quietly. That you'd demolish the carriage house, then gradually erase everything else that makes Oakwood special. She was protecting her life's work. Her life's work, my mother repeated, an edge in her voice. Not her daughter, not her grandchildren, a building. Not just a building, I countered. Everything it represents. Craftsmanship, continuity, connections to our shared past. Grandmother understood that some things, once destroyed, can never be recovered. And you're her chosen guardian, my father observed, his tone hovering between resentment and reluctant respect. I'm the trustee, I corrected, but this doesn't have to be adversarial. We can approach Oakwood's future as a shared responsibility, even if we bring different perspectives. My mother studied me with newfound attention. You've practiced that line, haven't you? Rehearsed this whole conciliatory approach. The accusation stung with its accuracy. I had indeed prepared for this conversation, anticipating the emotional currents and planning responses that might bridge our differences rather than deepen them. Is that wrong? I asked. To think carefully about how we might work together instead of against each other? It's calculated, she said, but without her usual dismissiveness. Strategic, like something your father would do. Ethan laughed suddenly, breaking the tension. Or like something you would do, Mom. Emma's not the emotional art student you've always painted her as. She's got both your strengths, Dad's strategic thinking, and your attention to presentation and detail. The observation hung in the air between us, surprisingly insightful from my brother who had typically maintained careful neutrality in family conflicts. He wasn't wrong. I had indeed drawn on traits from both parents in navigating this situation, though I'd always associated those characteristics more with my grandmother. There's something else we need to discuss, my father said, signaling to the catering staff to leave the room. When the door closed behind them, he continued. The investment group I've been working with still wants to develop part of the Oakwood property. They're proposing a modified approach that might be compatible with the preservation requirements. My guard immediately rose. What kind of modified approach? Luxury condominiums on the northwest corner of the property, the section with the old groundskeeper's cottage and greenhouse, he explained. Both structures are in poor condition and not original to the estate. The development would be architecturally sympathetic to Oakwood's character with strict design guidelines. I weighed this unexpected proposal. The groundskeeper's cottage, unlike the carriage house, had been built in the 1930s and held less historical significance. The greenhouse was newer still, a 1950s replacement for the original Victorian structure that had been damaged in a storm. From a strict preservation perspective, neither was essential to Oakwood's historical integrity. How many units? I asked, my mind already calculating the impact on the property's character and the potential financial implications. 6 residences on 2 acres, my father replied. High-end, low visibility from the main house, minimal infrastructure impact. The profit would be substantial, enough to create an endowment that could fund the Preservation Center's ongoing operations indefinitely. I hadn't expected this pivot, from outright opposition to a compromise that potentially served both our objectives. The financial sustainability of the Preservation Center remained my greatest concern. Grants and workshop fees might cover operations, but establishing a permanent endowment would secure its long-term future. I'd need to review the specific plans, I said cautiously, and any development would require careful archaeological assessment first. That section of the property hasn't been thoroughly documented. Of course, my father agreed, too readily. Full historical and environmental review, preservation-focused architects, the works. But if it proves viable, would you consider it? The question represented a significant shift in our dynamic, my father acknowledging my authority to approve or reject development on the property. seeking my consent rather than imposing his vision. The power balance had fundamentally changed, and we both recognized it. I'll consider any proposal that protects Oakwood's essential character while creating a sustainable foundation for its future, I said carefully. But I won't compromise on preservation standards, even for financial benefit. Fair enough, he nodded, again with that hint of reluctant respect. The detailed proposal will be ready for your review after the holidays. Dessert arrived. My grandmother's favorite lemon tart with raspberry coulis, along with coffee served in the delicate Meissen cups she had collected. As we ate, the conversation shifted to lighter topics. Ethan's recent promotion, my upcoming semester at Rhode SD, local gossip about neighbors whose Christmas decorations had reached new heights of competitive excess. It was the most normal family dinner we'd shared in years, the undercurrents of tension temporarily submerged beneath the ritual of shared food and deliberately neutral conversation. Only when coffee cups were empty and the candles had burned, low did my mother clear her throat with obvious purpose. "There's one more matter," she said, her perfectly manicured hands clasped before her on the table. "Your father and I have been discussing our living situation." My stomach tightened. Were they preparing to challenge their residential rights under the trust? To move out in protest of the new arrangements? "We've decided to relocate to the Cape House for the next 6 months," she continued, "while the preservation work is underway." This was unexpected. The house on Cape Cod had always been their summer retreat, not a primary residence. The construction noise and disruption would be challenging, she explained, meeting my questioning gaze directly. "And it seems appropriate for you to have full access to the property during this critical phase of the project." The implication slowly registered. They were offering me Oakwood, not just as trustee, but as resident. The main house would be mine to occupy while overseeing the Preservation Center's development. "I appreciate that," I said carefully, uncertain of the motivation behind this surprising concession. "It would certainly simplify the project management." "We'll maintain regular involvement," my father added quickly. "Weekend visits, project reviews. But the day-to-day oversight will be more efficient if you're on site." Ethan watched this exchange with undisguised interest. "Does this mean Emma gets my old room too?" he asked, a hint of his childhood competitiveness surfacing. My mother's lips twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "Your room remains yours for visits. Emma will take the East Wing suite. It's closest to the carriage house and has the best light for her photography work." The East Wing suite had been my grandmother's domain, her bedroom, sitting room, and private study forming a self-contained apartment within the larger house. That my mother would offer this space, with all its connections to grandmother Maggie, felt significant in ways I couldn't immediately articulate. "When would this transition occur?" I asked, mentally rearranging my plans to accommodate this unexpected development. "We'll depart after New Year's," my father said. "The Cape House needs some winterizing before extended occupation." As the evening drew to a close, I found myself in the library with Ethan while our parents spoke with the catering staff about cleanup. The room had been partially dismantled for restoration, bookshelves removed to reveal the original wall paneling, hidden beneath, creating a space in transition that matched our family's current state. "That went better than expected," Ethan observed, examining the empty spaces where the built-in cabinetry had concealed my grandmother's hidden letter for years. "No shouting, no ultimatums, no dramatic exits. We're evolving," I said dryly, running my fingers along the exposed walnut paneling. "Growing as people." "They're adapting," he corrected. "Dad especially. He recognizes you've outmaneuvered him, but instead of doubling down in opposition, he's looking for collaborative opportunities. That condo development proposal is his way of finding a role in this new reality." "And Mom?" I asked, curious about his read on our mother's uncharacteristically subdued demeanor throughout the evening. Ethan considered this. "Harder to parse. I think finding grandmother's letter rattled her more than she's showing. There's something between them, between who Mom is and who grandmother was, that's always been complicated. His insight surprised me. Ethan had always seemed oblivious to the emotional undercurrents in our family, focused on his own trajectory rather than the complex relationships surrounding him. Perhaps his investment banking career had developed his ability to read people in ways I hadn't recognized. "Do you think they're sincere about the Cape House plan?" I asked. "Or is it a strategic retreat?" "Both," he replied without hesitation. "They need distance from the physical changes happening at Oakwood, but they're also acknowledging your authority in a way that preserves their dignity. Classic negotiation tactic. Concede the point that's already lost while establishing favorable conditions for the next round." "There's always a next round with them," I sighed. "With all of us," Ethan corrected, his expression softening. "We're Mitchells, Em. Stubborn, strategic, and territorial by nature. The difference is that now you're playing the game as an equal, not as the rebellious daughter they could dismiss." As I drove back to Sophia's apartment that night, my grandmother's letter carefully preserved in my portfolio, I contemplated the shifting landscape of our family dynamics. The dinner had marked a transition point, not a complete reconciliation, but an acknowledgement of new realities and tentative steps toward a different kind of relationship. The prospect of living at Oakwood while overseeing the Preservation Center's development created both practical advantages and emotional complications. Returning not as subordinate daughter, but as legal trustee, would fundamentally alter my relationship with the property itself. The East Wing Suite, with its connections to my grandmother, would become my domain, a space from which to guide Oakwood's transformation while processing my own. December unfolded in a whirlwind of activity. The carriage house restoration accelerated, as weather permitted, with specialized craftspeople carefully reconstructing deteriorated elements using traditional techniques. Each day brought new discoveries, original paint colors revealed beneath later applications, handwritten construction notes from the 1890s builder found behind removed moldings, even my grandmother's initials carved discreetly into a beam during her first restoration effort decades earlier. I divided my time between documenting these discoveries, finalizing plans for the educational components of the Preservation Center, and preparing for my RISD program beginning in January. Jack proved an invaluable mentor throughout, sharing both technical expertise and philosophical perspective on the challenges of preservation advocacy. "Buildings outlast us," he observed one evening as we reviewed photographs of the carriage. "House restoration progress. That's their power and their vulnerability. They survive their creators, but their survival depends on each subsequent generation recognizing their value." His words resonated as I contemplated my role in Oakwood's ongoing story, not its owner in the conventional sense, but its temporary guardian, responsible for ensuring its transition to the next stewards with its essential character intact. The winter solstice, my grandmother's birthday, had marked a turning point in more ways than one. As December days gradually lengthened toward the new year, I found myself looking forward rather than backward, focused on possibilities rather than grievances. My parents' decision to relocate temporarily to Cape Cod represented an unexpected simplification, removing daily friction while facilitating my leadership of the preservation project. 2 days after Christmas, I returned to Oakwood with Jack to finalize photographic documentation of the carriage house before the next phase of interior restoration began. The main house stood quiet in the winter landscape, smoke curling from one chimney indicating my parents were in residence, but not actively entertaining. The recent snowfall had transformed the property into a 19th century picture postcard, the Victorian architecture enhanced by white frosted gables and snow-laden evergreens. "I can see why Maggie fought so hard to protect this place," Jack remarked as we crunched across the snow-covered drive toward the carriage house. "It's like walking into a different era." "That's what my parents never understood," I replied, unlocking the temporary construction barrier. They saw Oakwood as a prestigious address, not as a portal to historical connection. Grandmother experienced it differently, as a living link to craftsmanship and values worth preserving. Inside the carriage house, dramatic progress was evident. The peeling drywall had been completely removed, revealing the original brick interior walls and hand-hewn beam structure. Specialists had carefully cleaned decades of accumulated grime from the brick, restoring its warm terracotta color. The slate roof had been repaired using salvaged period materials, and the original carriage doors were being painstakingly restored in an off-site workshop. "The bones of this building are extraordinary," Jack observed, setting up his tripod to document the newly exposed roof trusses. "The craftsmanship in these joinery details. You don't see this quality in modern construction." We worked methodically throughout the afternoon, creating detailed documentation of each architectural element, the type of comprehensive record my grandmother had begun decades earlier, and that I would now continue with modern techniques. Jack's expertise guided my approach, helping me develop documentation protocols that would serve both immediate restoration needs and the educational programs planned for the center. As winter twilight descended, casting long shadows through the carriage, house windows, I heard footsteps approaching across the frozen ground. My father appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the dimming sky. "I thought I might find you here," he said, nodding a greeting to Jack before turning his attention to the exposed structure around us. "The restoration team has made remarkable progress." "They've uncovered rather than changed," I corrected gently. "Everything you're seeing was always here, just hidden beneath later modifications." He moved further into the space, examining the revealed brick walls and timber framework with unexpected attention. "I never really looked at this building before," he admitted. "Just saw it as underutilized square footage on a valuable property." "That's why we're creating the Preservation Center," I said, "to help people see historic structures as more than just real estate, to recognize the craftsmanship, the materials, the cultural connections." My father nodded slowly, his gaze traveling upward to the complex wooden truss system that had supported the roof for over a century. "Your grandmother tried to explain this to me once, why these old buildings mattered beyond sentiment or appearance. I didn't listen then." The admission hung in the winter air between us, perhaps the closest he had ever come to acknowledging a mistake. I chose my response carefully, sensing an opportunity for genuine connection rather than scorekeeping. "It's not always obvious unless you're shown how to see it," I offered. "Grandmother taught me to recognize these details from childhood: the hand-forged nails, the old-growth timber, the marks left by individual craftsmen. Once you start noticing them, they're impossible to unsee." Jack, with the intuition of someone who understood the significance of this exchange, quietly continued his photographic documentation at the far end of the building, giving us privacy, while remaining supportively present. "The Cape House is ready," my father said after a moment. "We'll move down there this weekend. The East Wing has been prepared for your occupancy whenever you're ready." "Thank you," I replied, genuinely appreciative of this accommodation. "I'll likely move in gradually over the next 2 weeks, as the RISD semester approaches." He nodded, then reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small leather case. "Your mother and I wanted you to have this," he said, extending it toward me. "It seems appropriate now." Inside the case was a key, not a modern reproduction, but a heavy, iron original with an ornate bow and complicated wards. "It's the master key to Oakwood," he explained. "The one that opens every original door in the house. Your grandmother kept it on her desk for years. We thought, it belongs with the trustee now." The gesture carried weight beyond the physical object, a symbolic acknowledgement of my role and responsibility that felt more significant than any legal document. I closed my fingers around the key, feeling its solid presence and all it represented. "I appreciate this," I said simply. "We'll be down at the Cape, but available for consultation as needed," he continued in a more businesslike tone. "The development proposal for the northwest section will be ready for your review by late January. I'll evaluate it carefully when it's submitted," I promised, maintaining the professional tone he seemed to prefer for these discussions. As he turned to leave, he paused at the doorway. "Your grandmother would be pleased," he said, gesturing to the ongoing restoration work. "With all of this, and with you." The statement, perhaps the most direct compliment he had ever offered, left me momentarily speechless. By the time I formulated a response, he had already departed, his footsteps crunching across the frozen ground toward the main house. Jack approached from the far end of the carriage house, his expression thoughtful. "That seemed significant," he observed. "It was," I confirmed, still processing the interaction. "Not quite an apology or a blessing, but an acknowledgement of sorts." "Preservation isn't just about buildings," Jack said, echoing our earlier conversations. "Sometimes it's about salvaging relationships, too, keeping what's valuable while allowing for necessary evolution." As January approached, bringing with it the official transition of Oakwood stewardship, I found myself contemplating this wisdom. My inheritance had initially appeared to be solely about property, the legal authority to protect historic structures from demolition or inappropriate development. But my grandmother's vision had been more comprehensive, encompassing not just buildings but the human connections they housed and symbolized. The East Wing suite awaited my occupancy. The carriage house transformation had begun in earnest, and my education at RISD would soon provide additional tools for documenting and directing these changes. Yet perhaps the most significant restoration underway was less visible, the careful, tentative rebuilding of family relationships that had seemed irreparably damaged when I'd been told to leave 4 months earlier. As twilight deepened into evening, Jack and I packed our equipment, preparing to leave the carriage house to the deepening winter darkness. The master key to Oakwood rested in my pocket, its weight a tangible reminder of both privilege and obligation. I was no longer the displaced daughter seeking validation, but the designated guardian of a legacy that extended beyond physical structures to encompass values, knowledge, and connections across generations. The new year would bring challenges I couldn't yet anticipate, particularly as my parents adjusted to their diminished authority, and I navigated my expanded responsibilities. The proposed development of the northwest corner would test my ability to balance preservation principles with financial pragmatism. My academic studies would demand time and energy, even as the Preservation Center project required constant attention. Yet as I locked the carriage house door against the winter night, I felt a certainty that had been absent throughout my earlier life at Oakwood. My grandmother had recognized something in me that my parents had overlooked, not just sentiment about old buildings, but a fundamental commitment to continuity and care that transcended mere ownership. In entrusting me with Oakwood's future, she had provided not just legal authority, but purpose, a role perfectly aligned with my natural inclinations and developing skills. The path ahead would not be without conflict or complexity, but it was unmistakably mine to walk, illuminated by both my grandmother's foresight and my own emerging vision for what Oakwood could become. As Jack and I crossed the snowy grounds toward our vehicles, the main house windows glowed against the darkness, a visual reminder of the continuity I had been entrusted to maintain. Light preserved against time's passage, warmth sustained through winter's chill, connection maintained across generations. The Oakwood Preservation Center opened on a perfect June morning, sunlight streaming through the restored carriage house windows and casting geometric patterns across the polished wooden floors. After months of restoration work, curriculum development, and careful planning, the transformation was complete, not just of the physical structure, but of its purpose and meaning. What had once been scheduled for demolition now stood as a testament to thoughtful preservation and adaptive reuse. I watched from the second-floor gallery as the first group of visitors moved through the exhibition spaces below. Architectural, students from 3 universities, preservation specialists, local historical society members, and curious neighbors who had watched the project unfold with varying degrees of skepticism and interest. Their expressions as they examined the detailed displays of traditional craftsmanship and restoration techniques told me everything I needed to know about the center's impact. "You've created something extraordinary here," a voice said beside me. I turned to find Professor Winters from RISD, who had become both mentor and advocate as I balanced academic requirements with the Preservation Center development. The integration of historical documentation with contemporary application is exceptional. This transcends typical preservation approaches. "That was always the goal," I replied, watching a master timber framer demonstrate traditional joinery techniques to an engrossed group of architecture students. Not just preserving artifacts, but continuing traditions, showing how historical methods remain relevant to contemporary challenges. Below us, visitors moved between carefully designed exhibits chronicling Oakwood's architectural evolution and the carriage house's recent restoration. My documentation photographs were displayed alongside my grandmother's historical images, creating a visual timeline that connected past efforts with present achievements. Interactive displays developed through Ethan's Digital Archive initiative allowed visitors to virtually explore construction details that would otherwise remain hidden within walls and under floors. The Massachusetts Historical Society exhibition team is arriving tomorrow, Professor Winters noted. "Based on what I'm seeing, Oakwood will become their centerpiece case study, exactly the kind of thoughtful balance between preservation and adaptation that the field desperately needs to showcase." This external validation mattered, confirming that what we'd created transcended family dynamics and personal vision to serve broader educational purposes. The Preservation Center had evolved from my defensive reaction to threatened demolition into a genuinely innovative model for historic property stewardship, one that might influence approaches to similar properties facing development pressure. My parents had returned to the main house 2 weeks earlier, settling into a carefully negotiated coexistence that respected both their residential rights and my continued authority as trustee. The physical boundaries established during their absence, the East Wing as my domain, the carriage house as the Preservation Center's headquarters, helped maintain the more balanced relationship we'd developed during their months at Cape Cod. To my surprise, they had embraced the opening day celebrations with unexpected enthusiasm. My father, dressed in uncharacteristically casual attire, was currently leading a small group through the exhibit detailing the limited development planned for the northwest corner, explaining how the careful integration of new construction would financially sustain the preservation efforts while respecting historical integrity. "The key is balance," I overheard him explaining to attentive listeners. "Not opposing change categorically, but ensuring it serves rather than diminishes the property's essential character. Development and preservation can be complementary when thoughtfully integrated." Hearing my father articulate this perspective, one he would have dismissed as impractical idealism just 6 months earlier, was perhaps the most profound transformation of all. His conversion wasn't merely strategic accommodation, but genuine intellectual engagement with preservation principles, finding authentic connections between his development expertise and the values the center represented. More surprising still was my mother's involvement. Currently stationed in the textile conservation exhibit, she was demonstrating period-appropriate upholstery techniques to visitors, her interior design background finding unexpected application in preservation education. Her knowledge of historical fabrics and furnishings, previously applied solely to maintaining Oakwood's appearance as a prestigious residence, now contributed meaningfully to its educational mission. "Your parents seem to have found their places in this new reality," Professor Winters observed following my gaze. "That's often the most challenging aspect of adaptive reuse projects involving family properties, helping everyone discover meaningful roles in the transformed space." "It's been a process," I acknowledged, remembering the tense confrontations and difficult negotiations that had preceded this moment of apparent harmony. "We're still finding our way, but at least we're all moving in the same direction now," the professor smiled. "Buildings and families, Both require constant maintenance and occasional significant renovation to remain viable. The best preservationists understand that principle applies equally to structures and relationships. As visitors continued to flow through the carefully restored spaces, I spotted Ethan near the digital archive installation, guiding users through the virtual exploration of construction techniques that had been his particular contribution to the center. My brother had surprised everyone, perhaps himself most of all, with his deepening engagement in the preservation project, eventually negotiating a part-time arrangement with his investment firm to accommodate his growing role at Oakwood. People actually care about this stuff, he had explained to me recently, watching users engage with the interactive exhibits he'd helped develop. They want to understand how things were built, how they can be maintained, how traditional methods might address contemporary challenges. It's the opposite of the planned obsolescence that dominates modern construction. This observation revealed how profoundly his perspective had shifted from viewing buildings solely as financial assets to recognizing their cultural and educational value, a transformation that paralleled our parents' evolving engagement with Oakwood's preservation. As the opening day activities continued, I found myself drawn to a quiet corner of the second-floor gallery where we'd created a small exhibit dedicated to my grandmother. Photographs showed Maggie in her element, documenting architectural details, conferring with craftspeople during earlier restoration efforts, teaching me to use her vintage cameras in the gardens surrounding Oakwood. Beside these images, her letter to me was displayed in a protective case, its closing lines highlighted. Remember always that buildings, like people, need both roots and wings to thrive. She would have loved this, Jack said, joining me before the display. Not just the preservation work, but how it's brought people together. Students, craftspeople, visitors. Maggie always believed historic buildings should teach, not just exist as static monuments. I wish she could see it, I admitted, studying her image. Confident, engaged, purposeful in her preservation efforts. Sometimes I feel like I'm having an ongoing conversation with her through this work, continuing something she began. You are, Jack confirmed. That's what legacies are. Not just physical assets transferred between generations, but values and visions carried forward, adapted for new circumstances. Maggie provided the roots, you're giving Oakwood wings. This metaphor, echoing my grandmother's letter, perfectly captured what we'd accomplished. Not merely preserving structures, but extending their relevance beyond physical boundaries through education, documentation, and continued practice of traditional skills. The carriage house had been transformed from underutilized storage to vibrant learning environment. The property that might have become luxury condominiums was instead becoming a nexus for preservation advocacy and education. As afternoon sunlight shifted across the exhibited artifacts and demonstration areas, I observed the first day's visitors engaging with Oakwood's history and ongoing evolution. Architecture students sketched traditional joinery details that would inform their contemporary designs. Homeowners consulted with preservation specialists about applying traditional techniques to their own properties. Craftspeople exchanged knowledge across specialties, creating new connections between traditionally separate trades. This was precisely the ecosystem of learning and exchange I had envisioned. Oakwood not as static museum, but as catalyst for continued practice and innovation in preservation approaches. The center wasn't about freezing time, but about connecting past knowledge with present challenges, ensuring traditional skills remained relevant in addressing contemporary needs. The Massachusetts Historical Society is going to want to document everything about this model, Professor Winters remarked, observing the dynamic interactions throughout the space. You've created something that transcends typical adaptive reuse projects, a template that could influence how we approach historic properties nationally. While this professional validation was gratifying, the personal significance of the day ran deeper. 6 months earlier, I had stood in my father's study, being told I was cut off financially for choosing photography over real estate development. That moment of rejection had initiated a journey I couldn't have anticipated. From displaced daughter to property trustee, from photography student to preservation center director. My grandmother's hidden trust had provided the legal mechanism for this transformation, but the actual evolution had required more than legal authority. It had demanded vision, persistence, strategic thinking, and ultimately the ability to bring others along rather than simply imposing my will. The Preservation Center existed not because I had defeated my parents, but because I had found ways to incorporate their strengths while maintaining the property's essential character, adaptive reuse applied to relationships as well as buildings. As the day's formal activities concluded and visitors departed, I found myself in the carriage house courtyard with my family, parents, brother, even Jack, who had become something between mentor and honorary relative through his connection to both my grandmother and me. The setting sun bathed Oakwood's Victorian facade in golden light, highlighting architectural details that generations of caretakers had preserved despite changing fashions and practical challenges. A successful launch by any measure, my father observed, his tone conveying genuine approval rather than the qualified acknowledgement I'd grown accustomed to in childhood. The attendance exceeded projections, and the engagement level was remarkable. People weren't just touring, they were learning. The timber framing demonstration had people captivated for nearly an hour, Ethan added. And the digital archive. Stations were continuously occupied. People wanted to understand how these buildings work, not just admire how they look. My mother, who had maintained her characteristic reserve throughout most of the day's activities, surprised me with an observation that revealed how fully she had absorbed the center's purpose. What struck me was the continuity. Seeing techniques your grandmother documented decades ago being demonstrated today, then applied to ongoing restoration. It's not preservation as taxidermy, it's preservation as living practice. This insight, from my mother, who had once dismissed my documentation photography as sentimental hobby rather than meaningful work, represented perhaps the most significant validation of the day. She had not only accepted, but internalized the preservation center's core philosophy, recognizing its value on its own terms, rather than measuring it against conventional metrics of success. That's exactly what grandmother hoped for, I acknowledged. Not just saving buildings, but continuing traditions, ensuring the knowledge and skills that created them wouldn't be lost. As darkness fell, security lighting illuminated Oakwood's distinctive silhouette against the evening sky. The Victorian turrets and gables, the restored carriage house, and in the distance, the groundskeeper's cottage awaiting its careful documentation before the northwest corner development began. The property had entered a new phase in its long evolution, neither frozen in time nor carelessly altered, but thoughtfully adapted to serve contemporary needs while honoring its historical significance. Later that evening, alone in my grandmother's study, now undeniably mine, with her books and photographs integrated with my academic materials and project plans, I reviewed the day's achievement with quiet satisfaction. The Preservation Center's opening represented not an ending, but a beginning. The establishment of a framework that would continue to evolve as new challenges and opportunities emerged. My RISD program would conclude in December, providing additional skills and credentials to support Oakwood's ongoing development. The Northwest Corner project would break ground in September, generating the endowment funds needed for long-term financial sustainability. The Massachusetts Historical Society exhibition would open in October, extending the center's influence nationally through its featured case study position. All of this had emerged from what had initially seemed like disaster, being cut off by my parents for pursuing photography instead of business, learning they planned to demolish the carriage house, discovering my unexpected inheritance. That moment of rejection had initiated a sequence of events that ultimately transformed not just my relationship with Oakwood, but with my family, creating space for growth and reconciliation that wouldn't have been possible within our previous dynamic. The Oakwood that existed now was neither the privileged residence of my childhood nor the development opportunity my parents had envisioned, but something new that incorporated elements of both while serving larger purposes. My grandmother's vision had provided the foundation, but the actual creation had required collaboration across generations and perspectives, each contributing necessary elements to the emerging whole. The summer months following the Preservation Center's opening brought unexpected developments that continued to reshape both Oakwood's future and our family dynamics. By July, the center's workshop schedule had expanded to accommodate growing demand, with waiting lists forming for the most specialized preservation craft courses. Local artisans began approaching us about residency opportunities, offering to teach traditional skills in exchange for studio space in the expanding preservation campus. This organic growth validated my vision while creating new challenges, balancing educational activities with the property's residential character, managing increased visitor traffic without compromising historical integrity, developing sustainable funding beyond the initial trust provisions. Each obstacle required careful navigation of competing priorities, testing both my leadership abilities and our family's evolving collaborative approach. My father, surprisingly, proved particularly valuable in addressing these organizational challenges. His business experience, once focused exclusively on development profits, found new application in creating sustainable operational models for the Preservation Center. One afternoon in late July, he appeared at my East Wing study with an unexpected proposal. "The center needs a formal operational structure beyond the trust framework," he explained, presenting a meticulously prepared analysis of our current management approach. "Something that can outlast any individual trustee and ensure continuity regardless of family dynamics." His proposal outlined a nonprofit foundation structure that would formalize the Preservation Center's educational mission, while creating appropriate governance mechanisms, a board of directors including both family members and preservation professionals, clear succession planning for leadership roles, and structured relationships with academic and professional organizations. "This would institutionalize what you've built," he concluded, ensuring it continues regardless of who serves as trustee in future generations. The suggestion revealed how fundamentally his perspective had shifted, from viewing Oakwood primarily as family property to recognizing it as cultural resource with significance beyond our personal connections. More importantly, it demonstrated his acceptance of the Preservation Center as permanent reality rather than temporary concession to my authority as trustee. "You're thinking about legacy," I observed, studying the organizational charts and succession plans he'd developed. "About Oakwood outlasting all of us." "Isn't that what preservation is ultimately about?" he replied, surprising me with this philosophical insight. "Creating frameworks that carry important things forward beyond individual lifespans?" This from the man who, less than a year earlier, had been prepared to demolish the carriage house for short-term profit, a transformation that reflected genuine evolution in his values rather than mere strategic adaptation to change circumstances. He hadn't simply accepted defeat in our power struggle. He had found authentic connection to preservation principles that resonated with his organizational strengths. My mother's evolution took different but equally meaningful forms. By August, she had developed a specialized workshop series on historical textiles and interior finishes that drew participants from major museums and restoration projects nationwide. Her extensive knowledge of period-appropriate materials and techniques, previously applied solely to maintaining Oakwood's appearance as prestigious residence, found new purpose in educating preservation professionals and homeowners. "I've been researching Victorian color theory," she announced one evening, appearing at my study door with arms full of historical paint catalogs and fabric samples. "The documentation we found during the carriage house restoration suggests Oakwood's original exterior color scheme was much more vibrant than the current white. I think we should consider a historically accurate repainting as our next major project." This suggestion, repainting Oakwood's extensive exterior in the polychromatic style typical of high Victorian architecture, would dramatically alter the property's appearance, replacing the dignified white that had defined it throughout my lifetime with a more historically accurate but potentially controversial color palette of earth tones, rich greens, and burgundy accents. That would be a significant change, I noted cautiously. The white exterior has become part of Oakwood's identity in the community, but not its historical identity, she countered with unexpected passion. The white is a 1940s colonial revival interpretation imposed on a high Victorian structure. If we're teaching authentic preservation, shouldn't we demonstrate it through our own practices? Her argument echoed preservation principles I'd learned at RISD. The distinction between history and heritage, between actual historical conditions and accumulated traditions that develop around historic properties. The white exterior, though not original to Oakwood, had become part of its 20th century identity and community presence. We could document both approaches, I suggested, recognizing an opportunity to demonstrate preservation's complex decision-making processes. Restore one facade to the original polychromatic scheme based on our research, while maintaining others in the current white. Use the contrast to educate visitors about how preservation choices reflect different values and priorities. This compromise, treating the repainting as educational opportunity rather than all-or-nothing decision, exemplified our family's evolving approach to Oakwood's stewardship. Instead of power struggles resulting in winner-takes-all outcomes, we were finding ways to incorporate multiple perspectives into more nuanced solutions that served both preservation principles and educational objectives. Ethan's contribution continued to evolve in unexpected directions as well. By September, his initial digital archive project had expanded into a comprehensive virtual documentation initiative that secured significant grant funding from a major technology foundation. Using advanced photogrammetry and 3D modeling techniques, he began creating detailed digital records of Oakwood's architectural elements, not just for exhibition purposes, but as preservation insurance against potential future damage or loss. If a disaster destroyed part of the physical structure, he explained as we reviewed the remarkably detailed virtual models, these records would enable accurate reconstruction using traditional methods. It's preservation through documentation, combining cutting-edge technology with traditional craft knowledge. This synthesis perfectly expressed the Preservation Center's founding philosophy, not opposing historical and contemporary approaches, but finding productive integration between them. Ethan had discovered meaningful application for his technological and financial expertise within preservation work, contributing essential elements that neither my historical knowledge nor my parents' practical experience could provide. The Northwest Corner development broke ground in mid-September, with carefully orchestrated archaeological monitoring preceding each phase of construction. The process revealed unexpected historical features, remnants of an early orchard predating Oakwood's construction, evidence of previously undocumented outbuildings, even Native American artifacts indicating the property's much longer human history. Each discovery was meticulously documented, with significant findings incorporated into both the development design and the Preservation Center's exhibitions. My father, who might once have viewed these archaeological discoveries as costly delays, instead embraced them as opportunities to enhance the development's distinctive character and connection to place. The 6 residential units took shape according to the approved designs, their construction quality and architectural sensitivity exceeding even the stringent requirements I had established as trustee. The premium these units will command justifies the additional investment in quality materials and craftsmanship, he explained during one of our project review meetings. We're creating residences for people who value historic context and architectural integrity, a different market segment than typical luxury development. This observation reflected genuine business insight about the economic value of preservation, rather than mere concession to regulatory requirements. Another indication of how thoroughly he had integrated preservation principles with his development expertise. What had begun as compromise imposed by the trust's restrictions had evolved into authentic commitment to quality and contextual sensitivity. The Massachusetts Historical Society exhibition, featuring Oakwood as its centerpiece case, study opened in October to significant attention from both preservation professionals and the broader public. The exhibit chronicled not just the physical restoration of the carriage house, but the complex decision-making processes involved in balancing preservation and adaptive reuse, including the limited development approach that would ensure the center's financial sustainability. What makes Oakwood particularly significant, the curator explained during the opening reception, is how it demonstrates preservation as dynamic process rather than static condition. The Mitchell family has created a model of thoughtful evolution that honors historical significance while addressing contemporary needs. Exactly the balance the preservation movement must achieve to remain relevant. This public recognition of our collective achievement, not just my vision or my grandmother's legacy, but the collaborative creation that had emerged from our initially adversarial positions, validated the difficult path we had traveled from conflict to cooperation. The preservation approach spotlighted in the exhibition hadn't emerged fully formed from any single perspective, but had developed through integration of multiple viewpoints, each contributing necessary elements to the successful whole. As autumn painted Oakwood's grounds in brilliant seasonal colors, I completed my final RISD project, a comprehensive documentation of the Preservation Center's development that would serve both as academic requirement and as operational manual for the Center's future leadership. The integration of coursework with practical application had created educational experience far richer than either component alone could have provided. Exactly the synthesis my grandmother had envisioned when establishing the educational fund within the trust. The anniversary of my departure from Oakwood, of being told to leave by parents who couldn't accept my educational choices, passed without explicit acknowledgement from any of us. Yet its significance hung unspoken in the background of our daily interactions, a reminder of how profoundly our relationships had transformed in 12 months. The power dynamics that had made that rejection possible no longer existed, replaced by more balanced exchange based on mutual respect rather than parental authority. "I've been thinking about that check," my father said unexpectedly one evening in late October, joining me on the East Wing terrace as I photographed sunset light on the carriage house's restored facade. "The one I gave you when you left. $5,000 to start your new life." The memory of that dismissive gesture, the check presented as extraordinary generosity while representing a fraction of what they had invested in Ethan's education, still carried emotional weight despite everything that had happened since. "What about it?" I asked, continuing to adjust my camera settings rather than meeting his gaze directly. "It seems almost comically inadequate in retrospect," he acknowledged, surprising me with this candid assessment. "A token gesture that completely missed the point of who you were and what you were capable of creating." This acknowledgement, not quite apology but genuine recognition of his misjudgment, represented significant evolution from the father who had dismissed my architectural interests as impractical hobby. That he could now see the limitations of his earlier perspective demonstrated growth I hadn't fully appreciated until that moment. "The amount wasn't really the issue," I said carefully, lowering my camera to face him directly. "It was what it represented, the conditional nature of your support, the dismissal of my choices as valid path rather than deviation from your expectations." He nodded, accepting this assessment without defensiveness. "I saw only what I wanted you to become, not who you actually were. Your mother and I both did in different ways." He gestured toward the Preservation Center, where evening workshop activities were still underway despite the gathering dusk. "This, what you've created here, would never have happened if we'd succeeded in making you conform to our vision." This recognition that my rebellion had actually been necessary assertion of authentic identity and purpose confirmed how profoundly our relationship had evolved. My father wasn't simply accommodating my temporary authority as trustee, but genuinely acknowledging the value of the path I had chosen against his wishes. "Sometimes rejection is redirection," I observed, quoting Professor Winter's favorite phrase about creative development. Being cut off forced me to find my own way, rather than following the path of least resistance. "Nevertheless," my father said with uncharacteristic hesitation, "we owe you an apology for how we handled that moment, for making your departure about financial punishment rather than respectful disagreement." The acknowledgement, coming nearly a year after the fact, carried more weight for its timing, offered not in the immediate aftermath of power reversal, but after months of rebuilt relationship and collaborative work. It wasn't prompted by shock or strategic necessity, but by genuine reflection on our shared history and transformed present. "Thank you," I said simply, accepting the apology without needing to emphasize its significance. We had moved beyond keeping score of injuries and vindications to recognizing our interdependence, despite continuing differences in perspective and priority. As the year's anniversary approached, the Preservation Center continued expanding its influence, hosting specialized workshops that attracted participants nationwide, developing curriculum materials for architectural programs at multiple universities, establishing professional certification credentials for traditional building crafts. The limited development in the northwest corner progressed according to schedule, its quality of execution and sensitivity to historical context earning recognition from architectural publications not typically associated with preservation advocacy. My parents and I settled into a functional coexistence that respected established boundaries. The East Wing remaining my domain, the main house theirs, the carriage house dedicated to educational programming with clearly defined operational protocols. Ethan divided his time between investment banking responsibilities in Boston and growing involvement with the Preservation Center's technological initiatives, finding unexpected synergy between these seemingly disparate professional worlds. On the exact anniversary of my departure, a crisp December day with the first snow dusting Oakwood's formal gardens, I found myself alone in the carriage house after hours, reviewing documentation photographs from the year's transformation. The before and after comparisons told a compelling story of physical restoration, deteriorated structure renewed through traditional craftsmanship and contemporary technology, historical character preserved while new purpose was established. Yet the more significant transformation remained largely undocumented, the evolution in family relationships that had paralleled the building's restoration. The parents who had rejected my choices now participated in implementing my vision, contributing their respective strengths to something they once would have dismissed as impractical idealism. The brother who had embodied conventional success now questioned those metrics, finding unexpected fulfillment in preservation work alongside his finance career. As I prepared to leave for the evening, the carriage house door opened unexpectedly, revealing my mother silhouetted against the snowy landscape. She entered hesitantly, as if uncertain of her welcome in this space that had become primarily my domain, despite its public educational purpose. "I thought I might find you here," she said, moving further into the illuminated interior. She carried a carefully wrapped package, which she placed on the central workbench with deliberate care. "Your father and I wanted to acknowledge the anniversary. Not to reopen old wounds, but to recognize how far we've all come since that day." Inside the package was a leather-bound album containing photographs I'd never seen before. My grandmother. As a young woman working on Oakwood's early restoration, my childhood self following her with a toy camera, documentation of architectural details I'd photographed years later without knowing she had captured the same elements decades earlier. Maggie kept these separate from the family albums, my mother explained. A parallel documentation that none of us fully appreciated until now. She saw something in you from the beginning, a continuation of her vision that neither your father nor I could understand at the time. The album represented acknowledgement of continuity I had always felt, but my parents had previously rejected, the natural inheritance of my grandmother's preservation passion, rather than rebellious rejection of family expectations. This recognition, Coming on the anniversary of being told to leave for following that passion carried healing power beyond any formal apology. She was building a foundation, I observed, studying the photographic evidence of my grandmother's methodical documentation. Creating the record that would inform future preservation work, even when she knew she wouldn't be here to direct it. And preparing you to continue that work, my mother added with unexpected insight. Not just through the legal mechanism of the trust, but through shared experience and transmitted knowledge. The official inheritance was just confirmation of what had already happened between you. This understanding, that my connection to Oakwood transcended legal ownership to encompass shared vision and purpose, reflected how thoroughly my mother's perspective had evolved. She had moved beyond seeing the property primarily as family status symbol or financial asset to recognizing its cultural significance and educational potential. She would be pleased with what we've all created here, my mother continued, gesturing to the preservation center that had emerged from our initially conflicting visions. Not just the physical restoration, but the new purpose. The way Oakwood has become something more significant than private residence or development opportunity. As we stood together in the transformed carriage house, once scheduled for demolition, now vibrant educational center, the journey from conflict to collaboration felt complete. Not in the sense of perfect resolution or unanimous agreement, but in the establishment of functional balance that respected diverse perspectives while serving shared objectives. The Preservation Center would continue evolving as new challenges and opportunities emerged. The Northwest development would soon welcome its first residents, generating the endowment funds needed for ongoing educational programming. My documentation work would expand to include not just Oakwood's physical features, but the living traditions, being practiced and transmitted through its workshops and residency programs. What had begun as crisis had transformed into opportunity, not just for the buildings, but for the relationships housed within them. My grandmother's foresight in establishing the trust had provided the legal mechanism for this transformation, but the actual evolution had required all of us to grow beyond familiar patterns and expectations. As winter darkness settled over, Oakwood's grounds, security lighting illuminated the Victorian architecture against the night sky, the distinctive turrets and gables standing as testament to both historical craftsmanship and continuing stewardship. The property had weathered significant transitions throughout its existence, adapting to changing circumstances while maintaining essential character, exactly the balance we were now achieving in our family relationships. The inheritance my grandmother had left was ultimately not just legal authority over property, but a vision of stewardship that transcended conventional ownership. Responsibility not just to maintain buildings, but to ensure their continued relevance and vitality. In fulfilling that vision, I had discovered capabilities I hadn't recognized in myself, while also acknowledging the complementary strengths others brought to the shared project of preservation. What my parents couldn't possibly have known when they told me to leave was that in cutting me off, they had initiated the sequence of events that would ultimately transform both Oakwood and our family, creating possibility for growth and reconciliation that wouldn't have emerged within our previous dynamic. The crisis that had seemed like ending had instead become beginning, opening pathways to futures none of us had imagined, but all could ultimately embrace. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.